when you look at the industry and what's happening around us, expectations of business leaders have changed. They're going to continue to change because of things like AI.
What exactly is a chief of staff?
I think the chief of staff is the right-hand person to the CEO. Right? So it's not about being an expert, but it's about being curious and asking the right questions and helping people solve for themselves.
In theory, that's true, right? Everyone in the company is working towards the same goal. So why conflicts, right?
Yes, exactly.
Power struggles, ultimately.
Ultimately, yeah. And I think you've captured it really well.
What role should the chief of staff play in shaping company culture and employee engagement?
Maybe I won't answer this how you think I might.
So how would the chief of staff also approach conflict within the executive team?
Oh God, this is really conflicting. This is awful.
Yeah, it's like choosing a favorite son, right?
Yeah.
Which one is a favorite?
Yeah. I have to caveat with,
Lou, nice to meet you. Thank you for accepting this invitation, be part of the show.
Thank you for having me.
To help here to start the conversation and to give a bit of an introduction to everyone that is listening to this video. In your profile, we can see that you have an HR background. You have several years of experience working in several roles, including leadership in HR, where you have aligned people with strategy and operation. But recently, you've made a transition from a more people-focused role to more strategic and operational, calling yourself or using a chief of staff approach, which is something very curious to me, because I see, from the way I see it, chief of staff could be the next step potentially for someone that achieves a leadership role in HR, and then a chief of staff could be next. But I'm not sure. So I decided to reach out to you and understand better why you did the change, why is the change possible, and what comes with it in terms of responsibilities. Is this a correct summary of what the challenge you have right now in your life?
Yeah, I think so. And I think calling it a challenge is probably pretty accurate out, because as you've recognized in our world and in our industry, it's been tricky to really, stepping out on my own, out of the corporate world. I've seen the assumptions that are tied to job titles when it comes to HR and HR leadership. And I think, for me, my background has been across a lot of different business contexts and industries. But I've been in a number of standalone roles. I've been in tech startups. I've been in a lot of organizations that have required the skills and the traits that you might see in a chief of staff, without the label that has come with that. And I've seen that right up the chain, I suppose. There's a lot of CPO levels actually doing the role of a chief of staff because that's what the business requires of them. But it's often a subconscious thing, right? We're doing what needs to be done because
someone has to do it.
Someone has to do it. We have to understand, it's all good and well having a business strategy, but actually operationally, can that even be delivered? And that work I've seen, in a startup environment, everybody is who they need to be, right? You're leaning in, you're wearing all the hats, and naturally you're rolling up your sleeves and you're sitting beside the people doing the work to understand, can our goals be achieved? Where are the blockers? How can I remove them? And so you're sitting far more in that side of the operational elements of people and of strategy than you are on the compliance traditional HR side of things. Mm-hmm. And that's just naturally the culture of the startup environment, of hyper growth, of scaling companies. But I think what I've seen as I moved into different industries, so I spent some time in a digital agency and then a medcoms agency, and agency life brings a similar pace to as a startup would. But I think I could still see actually that there was still this need to be more strategic and more operational as a people leader. And I was starting to see that trend. And then as I made the decision to step out on my own, because I wanted to spend my time working on that strategic side of things, I wanted to do the work that means the distracting side of HR doesn't have to be done so much. The approach I saw, it's not really been defined. I met a lot with people in my industry who, well, what is it you do? What's your title? And it has to kind of sit in one of these roles that we already know about, and, comes with a very set list of responsibilities. And I, when you look at the industry and what's happening around us, expectations of business leaders have changed. They're going to continue to change because of things like AI, right? A lot of the admin policy, I mean, you think of generative AI, handbooks are going to be something a manager can just ask a question to on a chatbot very soon, right? A lot of that work is going to probably be done by AI, and HR are pretty slow to adopt it on the whole. But that doesn't mean the expectations of business leaders haven't changed. They have. And they want to know, how are we adding more value? How are we being more strategic? And for me, through my career, and where I'm really leaning in now, is it's that bridge, right? It's that I'm that person who works with the leadership team to help them build the business strategy, because I know the team so well. And I can work alongside the people doing the work to make sure the work they're doing is adding value. It's moving us towards meeting our goals, and I can remove blockers as they come up. Those teams as well. So it's really an intersection, I would say, across people, strategy, and operational delivery. And that chief of staff role encompasses that. And it can show up very differently in different organizations, right? In some, it might lean more into the revenue side of things. They might look more at marketing, at sales, at BD. But for me, this is what my career has been. And I see a gap in how we describe that in the HR world.
Okay. I think we should have addressed in the beginning of the conversation the elephant in the room, which is, what exactly is a chief of staff? What's your definition? You already mentioned mix between people, strategy, operations. But normally, what does a chief of staff do? Because it sounds, from the words you're using, sounds very similar to like a chief of operations. But is it different in your view?
I think so. I think the chief of staff is the right-hand person to the CEO, right? The chief of staff actually enables the CEO to, I've seen it described recently really well, stay in their zone of genius, right? Allow the CEO to be the visionary, to be the person focused on growth, on the future, and really leading. And I think
the CEO, the operational programs on your shoulders, and let the CEO.
Exactly, right. The trusted person, the ear to the ground. They can trust that you have such a deep understanding of not just their teams and the operations, but the business model, right? I know how we're making money. I know what our strategy is, because I've helped build it. All right, I have a seat at the leadership table, and I work so closely with your teams that I can help you see, where the dependencies are, where the blockers are going to be, and what the tactics therefore need to be able to actually achieve the strategic goals.
Even if they are technical, as a chief of staff, you'll be able to help?
In a technical business, you mean?
If the company has some kind of technology that produces, could be IT, engineering, etc. How much chief of staff would be able to help? Because that you get into an area which is not your area of expertise, right?
Yeah, it's a really fair question, and I'm smiling now, because this is probably something I value really, really highly, and it's actually been really valuable to me, is curiosity, right? So it's not about being an expert, but it's about being curious and asking the right questions and helping people solve for themselves. So in essence, you're building mindsets and ways of working and behaviors in the people in the business, so that when you're not there, they can still solve problems. They can still remove blockers. They have such clarity themselves on what it is we're trying to achieve, that you've built those habits and those reflexes in the team. I'm not a technical expert. I've been a performance coach in a past life when I was in eBay. And one of the biggest takeaways that I've carried through my whole career is it is such a benefit to not know. Because when you ask questions, when you're curious, they land in a really sincere way, right? People don't feel like, are you trying to catch me out? This is the chief of staff that works with the CEO, right? Or, the people leader, whatever the job title is. They feel engaged in a conversation and engaged in a, right, let's think creatively about how we might solve this problem. And so, yeah, I don't feel any need to be an expert. I work, like I've said, I've worked across so many different business contexts and industries. I've not been an expert in any one of those, but I do have the ability to deeply understand the business model, business context, and therefore solution with teams, alongside teams, to remove those blockers.
That's indeed very interesting. So you while others may have like emotional link with the problems, or maybe bias because of power struggles, etc. You may have that objective view on things, disconnected emotionally, so you can ask like really objective questions about what's happening and see objectively where the problems are, being apart from them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, look, on the people side of things and on the leadership side of things, it's very important that you communicate your accountabilities to people as well. So, you have to, I will always say the thing, right, and call out the elephant in the room, as you say. You're going to sit in a position of either people see you as HR, if they don't know you, right, before you've built trust, or they see you as a member of the leadership team, or there on behalf of the CEO. And so you have to anticipate there might be a little bit of resistance, or people might feel a little bit armored up. And so I think a really important part of that is helping people to understand that their success is yours. You're equally as accountable for the success of them and the team and the business,
right?
As they
approach.
are. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Can you share an example of a challenge or a kind of blockage that you have removing on a client or a situation that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely.
And something that would be like far away from HR, right? To come up with an example that would be really a chief of staff kind of juicy example.
Yeah, I think look, in agency life is probably a good example in terms of how their business model works, right? They sell time. Time is what they do, right? And whatever the business service is, time is the most important thing. How we spend it, how chargeable that time is as well, right? It's not about just being busy; it's about being able to bill it. And in one organisation I was in, I was working alongside some of our finance business partners, project managers, to understand why we weren't meeting targets, right? We were way off and never really getting to the root of where that problem sat. And so for this business, there was a big focus on utilization, right? How much of people's time is being used up, is being scheduled. So if there's an 8-hour day, you want 85, 90% of that time utilized, right? Time for meetings.
Being billable, that's what you say.
Well, that's different. So their focus was really on this utilization target. And what they hadn't recognized was the behaviors that had really been embedded over years in these teams to use up their time. So what happened was, you might say, okay, here's a 2-hour piece of work that you've been allocated for the day. And people are using up that 2 hours. Even if they can do it in one, they're going to use up the 2 hours, because if I don't, my utilization target's going to
increase.
Well, I won't meet it. It will just look like I'm not using up my time. And so my role there was to really consider, I suppose, in terms of systems, if I change this, or if we pull this lever, what's going to happen elsewhere? And working alongside our finance business partners, because they were the ones seeing the output of that on the other end. We had to build KPIs and governance around chargeability, billable time, and that becoming the focus for people. And that created a shift in mindset and in the behavior that we saw in people, because suddenly using their time effectively became more important than just being busy. And so that's probably a good example of working really cross-functionally with project managers, finance business partners, and leadership teams to help them understand, it's important that we can see people have their time scheduled and it's being, used, but effective use of that time is what actually changes the dial in terms of revenue.
In my experience, Lou, I've seen that one of the biggest issues that exist is communication cross teams. And the reason for that, maybe there are two reasons for that. First one is that everyone is really, really focused on their own backyard. It's like customer support, it's tech, it's product. And the communication between those departments sometimes lacks being efficient, right? And the second problem is that because everyone is looking into their own backyard, they are always trying to keep the power within the backyard to retain control of things, etc. So when someone else comes from another department to try to say, hey, you should change customer support this way, or the product is not working because of this, that, there's also always resistance. Who is this guy, or this person doesn't understand, etc. So I always saw that a chief of operations or a chief of staff, or someone that could have an overview of all the departments, must be also a good person to facilitate conversations between departments, create the proper processes, and block or destroy those communication issues. How would you do that as a chief of staff? What are the best techniques to make teams work efficiently with each other?
Yeah, I've seen this a lot. A lot of silos, and it creates this like us against them sort of mentality in a business. And actually, some of the work I'm doing at the moment with a company is, you've described the challenge perfectly. They've got they have that us against them across their sales and their operations team. And the type of work that I would do is not so much about, I'm working mostly with the sales side of things, right? And I take the approach of helping people to understand their stakeholders and the expectations that come with them. So I think operationally teams kind of tend to lean on assuming stakeholders are external or more senior. And one of the exercises that I might do, and I'm running next week actually, is backcasting. And it's really, really powerful on a number of fronts. So I would take a co-creation approach to any of the work that I do, whether that's building a business strategy or that's building an operating system for a sales team. But this is one of the exercises I find to be most powerful. And what it does is it takes a snapshot of the current state, right? Here's what we know to be true. And here's what leadership priorities are, right? And I'll always be very upfront. They exist. We can't ignore them. They exist. And we have to acknowledge that in whatever we're going to build and whatever the future looks like.
You mean like the company goals when you say leadership priority? Are those
it might be company goals. Yes, exactly. Okay. It might be just considering a leadership stakeholder and what we know is a real priority for them. But we just acknowledge that as part of any planning. Backcasting then gets a team really thinking about their stakeholders. And it is quite incredible how many stakeholders any team might have that they don't consider as stakeholders. And often that's where you get that butting heads. You're both actually working towards the same goal, but you don't quite realize it. And you're not looking at each other like stakeholders.
In theory, that's true, right? Everyone in the company is working towards the same goal. So why conflicts, right?
Yes, exactly.
Power struggles, ultimately.
Yeah, and I think you've captured it really well. People feel a sense of loss.
I've had my share of that in my life.
Yeah, it's human nature, right? We all have a pride and we all have a bit of ego. It's there. Yeah. But I think if you can very objectively help people to see, look, the reality is you have these stakeholders, right? So for this sales team, the operations team are a stakeholder, right? Because they're sending this stuff out to the customers that you've won and you need to retain and you need to keep happy. And so we have to consider what expectations they might have of you as a member of the sales team. And it can be a struggle for people to acknowledge that initially. But when it's done, and you really, my facilitation in that is to really help them stay in that zone of the shoes of that team or that stakeholder. And you would be amazed the list of expectations they can come up with. And they might not agree with them. They don't have to agree with those expectations. It's just about acknowledging that they're there. So, we can butt heads and we can argue and we can spend our time doing that, or we can acknowledge the expectation is there. And how can we build this out, build an operating system or a sales strategy for this team that our stakeholders see a piece of themselves in, that they feel, yeah, I was acknowledged, our priorities have been heard, and they are reflected in the strategy of the sales team. And so it's sort of a baby step approach to getting a team to think outside of their own seat. Your priority is our priority, but they're not the only one. And beyond that, the next step would be about, right, how do we now bring that stakeholder into that co-creation process? So there's a moment of, what are your priorities? What does this look like for you? And how can we make sure we're contributing to that through the sales strategy? So I think co-creation is really, really powerful, because I always say people don't argue with their own data, right? So if you've included people and they feel heard in a sincere and valuable way, generally the plan that you come up with, I've not seen a lot of pushback or a lot of disagreement around, because people...
Against data is difficult, indeed.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think backcasting is really powerful for anybody who's seeing those silos or that sort of mentality.
I know that you have an HR background, so the next question, maybe you'll be biased. We all know that, but I'm still interested in going through this one, which is, what role should the chief of staff play in shaping company culture and employee engagement? Imagining a chief of staff that did not come from HR, how would that person be relevant in company culture and engagement?
Yeah, maybe I won't answer this how you think I might, but I see those things probably I describe those things. Look, they're so subjective, aren't they? And I suppose for me, your company culture is your operating system. It is, your brand reputation, your operating procedures, your behaviors, right? All of the informal, formal systems that come together to create an experience, for your employees and for your customers. And that's for the good or the bad, right? It creates an experience. And that's probably how, when I talk about culture, I'm talking about those things. So a lot of the work that I do touches those areas, and creates a system where people know how to respond, how to make decisions, because those things are so clear to them. So that might include things like your vision and your values. But for me, it's how you map those to being tangible tools that people can use day to day and operationally to make decisions, to remove blockers. I think on, what was the other piece you said? Culture and
engagement.
And engagement. Yeah, I view engagement really as an emotional connection to an organization. That's my sort of definition of employee engagement. And I think the human side of that is what drives it. I don't believe keeping people happy at all costs drives employee engagement. It's important that people are happy, but it's not the only factor. I think challenging people and creating, room for growth that might feel uncomfortable at times for people, but where they can see your intention is good and is for their good. And that can look like a difficult conversation sometimes. That can look like, giving people feedback they don't always want to hear, but ultimately they'll reflect on and see the growth that happened in them because of that. And look, it's multifaceted employee engagement. There's so much that contributes to it, from, their engagement on a business level with the vision, right? Do they understand that? Do they understand the work they do on a daily basis and how it contributes to that? And can they see a future for themselves with that organization? Is it something that they really believe in? So, I suppose in lots of ways what I've described as a chief of staff approach, it touches on all of those things. It's not necessarily about just the HR, the person, the human side of things. It absolutely is, but it's also creating a system where they feel they can actually do their best work and they can grow with it. And they're not met with frustrations and blockers and, here we go again, another initiative that won't follow through. And they have trust and belief in their leaders and in the vision of the business. I think that they're the things that I think drive engagement, but I think there's no getting away from the operating system that actually allows for them.
see the chief of staff being part of the C-level, the executive team, right? And always look down. But we know that within executive teams, there's also conflict. So how would the chief of staff also approach conflict within executive team members?
I don't think too differently, to be honest, How. I think, that piece of, I call it co-creation, right? I'm sure there's a lot of different terms for it, but I think aligning everybody to one goal and having a system that delivers that. I think leadership operating systems can look very different, and they should. I think they require a lot of discipline to bring leadership teams together in terms of executing on goals. So for the work that I do with leadership teams, I bring a lot of EOS principles into that. So EOS, yeah. So EOS is the entrepreneurial operating system. I would have a look at it if you've not heard of it. It's incredible. It's incredible. I was introduced to it a few years ago, and it was when I was part of a leadership team in a digital agency, a creative agency. And it was the best run leadership team I'd ever seen. They were so disciplined about delivery. They didn't over-engineer it, right? We were still human. We still had fun and we still had conversation. But EOS is a simple system to delivering your business goals. And it starts from having a very clear vision, having a tactical plan to deliver that, looking at the people in your organization. You do what's called gets it, wants it, has the capacity to deliver it. Have we got the right people in the right roles effectively? But operationally, I think that's where it becomes very powerful. So you've got what are called ROCs, and they're basically your quarterly goals. And they are the things that you talk about every single week in your weekly meetings. So they call them level 10 meetings. And it is a structure to meetings that gets you review your quarterly ROCs, you look at your to-do list, you close off those things from last week, you talk about your headlines, what's going on in the business. But what a lot of leadership teams can do is they get stuck there in the FYIs, in the heads up, and this is what went on in my world this week. But that can become the, I suppose, the highlight reel, rather than actually looking at where the problems were. And as a leadership team, how we remove those. And so what this level 10 weekly meeting system does is it keeps you focused on the issues. So you spend most of your time, it's a 90-minute meeting every week, and you spend most of your time solving issues. And there's even things like a voting system so that leadership teams can vote. You put all your issues in there, and then leadership teams can vote on the ones that they think are priority. Now, you try and get through as many as you can, but you still have a way of prioritizing the ones that you talk about there and then, and the next ones you bring into the next meeting the following week. But it's an incredibly disciplined system to operationally delivering your business strategy and your vision. And when you can align leadership teams to that, it's completely objective. There's just somebody chairing a meeting, and it keeps you on track and focused on the right things. So it doesn't become a sort of he who shouts the loudest operation.
Nowadays that we have that mix between remote, back to office, hybrid, etc. Mm-hmm. What kind of adjustments does a chief of staff needs to do when doing his work?
There's a lot of strong views around that topic, isn't there? I think there's, in terms of the work that I do with that chief of staff approach, not a lot changes. I'm very used to being on remote teams, fully remote. In startup worlds, didn't meet a lot of my team face to face. So, we built ways of working asynchronously, of default into action. We were in different time zones. We couldn't wait for people to wake up to get work done. And so that was built into the culture. I think what I've seen, and I've seen recently the other side, I've worked alongside leadership teams who've mandated return to office. And I think the role of, my role in that, of that chief of staff approach when it comes to people and strategy, is to help leadership teams understand why they're doing it and actually create a strategy around it so that, have people come back to the office because they want to come back to the office, not because you mandated it. And I think that's a step that's missed a lot of the time. I've seen a lot of knee-jerk reactions to that as well. there's a problem here. Let's get everybody back in the office because there was a point in time we were in the office and this problem didn't exist. And it's kind of an oversimplification, I think, is what I've seen of that problem and how else we might solve it. Because the other side of it is, and my role in that has been to help leadership teams recognize, yes, you can mandate returning to the office, but generally you're doing that 1 or 2 days a week. You still have 60 to 80% of your working week remote. So you still need a remote working strategy and practice that delivers your business strategy. You can't get away from it. You have to have both if you want people in the office. So I see value. I was converted. I was completely remote, and I saw the value and the pace that you could gain through that, and the efficiencies operations wise. And I see value in face-to-face now. I didn't always believe that was there, if I'm being honest. And then when I leaned into it, sometimes it's just the energy. Sometimes I leave a day in the office, or I did with my team, and I felt really energized. I felt really focused for the week ahead. So, those things are important. But I've also seen leadership teams say, oh, it's about connection. We're going to get a lot of connection. And I'm very data driven. So I'm thinking, how do you know that to be true? How can you show people that will be the outcome? Because, the chief of staff, I suppose their role in that is to help leadership teams see the blind spot. If you don't achieve that, if you've not thought it through in terms of how you measure that, you damage your credibility in the process. People will be saying, well, you said that would happen and nothing's changed really. So I think the role of the chief of staff really is the blind spots. Have we thought this through? How do we create motivation and a want for people to get back to the office, and what does that look like? And engage people in a plan, right? A strategy to achieve the outcomes, and not just putting all of our eggs in that return to office basket.
For the people that are listening who are business leaders, HR leaders, etc., and they are from other countries and they have the chance to work in fully remote companies where back in office is not an option, because sometimes there's not even an office, everything's remote. What are the biggest operational challenges that you see out there in this kind of environment, and how to approach them?
I think it's those expectations and experiences and maybe preferences that people have about communication, I suppose, in terms of communication, working together. Communication's a big one, remote working wise. It's not easy to achieve successful remote working. You have to over communicate. So what would land well and clearly in an office environment, you have to over communicate in a remote working environment. So that might mean, you might have an all hands meeting or a full team meeting in an office. And actually you have to do that, but follow up with an email and maybe a Slack message, and use all the different forms of communication that you have to get information to people and for it to land well. Because, practically speaking, what can happen is you have an overlap of time zones. So, for example, I worked with a team in the US, and by the time I was finishing my day here, the US team were just starting. There's a very short overlap. And what that can mean is, we had a meeting and here's the recording and here's the notes. You can do all that work. But actually that person in the US is being bombarded with a handover of work. We've 1 hour to get you up to speed on everything that happened in our UK day. So suddenly the team communication or whatever it was that happened in that team meeting becomes deprioritized, and they might never really get to it. So you've got to acknowledge people's days look very different dependent on where their time zones might be. And so over communicating is very important. There's a big role in managers, I think, to make sure that they're actually closing loops. Did you get a chance to look at this? Do you understand the why behind what we're doing? And really making sure that clarity is there for people. I think, in terms of preferences, there are people who have a preference for face-to-face. And I think if you've got a preference for remote working, or that's the model of the business, you've got to be able to pick up the phone a lot more, I think, or the camera a lot more, I think. I've seen organizations where, even things like camera off, you might not feel like that makes a big difference, but it's creating another level of connection, and you've got to take as many of those as you.
It's a clear sign of disengagement.
I think so. That would be my view. Yeah. So it's I don't like the word mandate, and I don't like to policy things. But if you can help people to understand the benefits of doing these things, and that benefit might not always be for them. It might be how you show up as a team player. That's understandable. And on the other side of things, I think fair doesn't always mean the same. There are reasons some people have to have a camera off, or on a certain day might need to have their camera off. And it's, I suppose, building a tolerance for people, and an expectation in each other, that we will do the best. And when people can't, we will assume the best in people as well. So it's really a cultural thing as well, I think, how.
Cultural is also an issue when you work with people from all over the world, because you need to be careful how you communicate, because not everyone will absorb the message the same way.
Yes.
So that's a big challenge as well, I assume, for a chief of staff, right? That is speaking with everyone in the company from every culture, etc. Yes,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm Irish, so I can be quite sarcastic sometimes, right?
Oh.
And that doesn't always land.
That's dangerous. That's dangerous.
It can be. So I've got to check that one.
Yeah.
But you're dead right. Look, I think it's one of the beauties of a global workforce, is the diversity of culture, of experience, of what people's day-to-day lives look like. And I think in any organization who's building a remote team, a global team, curiosity is one of the biggest things I think that you can build in your culture, build into your culture, because it creates a bit of safety, I think, for people to ask questions, to say, oh, I don't know actually what that might look like for you. Or a cultural, something as simple as a cultural holiday, creating moments to spotlight that, to share, what does that look like for you? What do you celebrate, and what does it mean for you? And look, I think that's one of the, I suppose, most privileged positions to be in a people role, in any people role, is to be able to hear the human side of, without getting too fluffy, the meaning of life for people. We all are here to do a job for a reason, and it's generally to support the life that we want to live outside of work.
Yes.
And I think you can show a lot of respect, curiosity, and bring people together by celebrating those things. And
that's true.
I think for people, DE&I, EDI, whichever we call it now, it can scare people, into saying nothing, into not asking questions for fear of saying the wrong thing. But if you have a culture where there's safety to ask questions, and when you ask questions, they land with, good intent behind them. I mean, that's incredibly powerful for people working together, for people, that conflict we talked about earlier on, people assuming the best in each other, regardless of how that might feel in the moment. It's really powerful.
Yeah. You frame it very well. Curiosity indeed is something that makes perfect sense when you are celebrating all the days out there where your workforce is, because you are recognizing that you are important. We are also celebrating whatever happens in India. But for the rest of the people, if you have that intellectual curiosity, it's also a chance for you to learn. This thing happens in India. It's an important thing. So you get value from that. I personally do. I personally celebrate those different holidays around the world, and I get to know how those countries work from that perspective as well. Okay, so thank you for sharing, Lou. I have a challenge for you. Not sure if you've seen on other episodes, but when the guest has that generalistic HR background, I make the guest go through the challenge of giving you 2 topics in HR and making you choose which one is more important. Then I drop the one that you don't choose, and I bring another one, and I force you to choose again, and again and again. And then in theory, in the end, Lou, we will have the HR topic that you consider most important. Okay? But I know this is going to be very unfair for you, because as a chief of staff, you will have that very polite perspective that everything is important, everyone is relevant in the company, etc. So there are no relevant topics and non-relevant topics. So that's why I want to challenge you with doing this. Okay. So let's see how it goes. we start with talent acquisition and training and development. Which one would you choose?
Training and development.
Training and development and compensation and benefits.
Training and development.
Training and development versus performance management.
Training and development.
Training and development versus employee relations.
Oh, training and development.
Training and development versus workforce planning and HR analytics. The data side, right?
I know, I'm torn. I'm going to go analytics. Yeah.
Okay, there's a change. So workforce planning and HR analytics versus diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow. So DEI versus HR technology and systems.
Oh God, this is really conflicting. This is awful.
Yeah, it's like choosing a favorite son, right? Yeah. Which one is a favorite son?
Yeah. I have to caveat with, I like the tech side of things because I like the efficiencies and the automation. So that's pulling me. I think you can gain a lot of that through DE&I. So I'm going to go DE&I.
Last one to release you from the pain. DEI or versus engagement and retention.
DE&I.
Wow, what a surprise, Lou.
Yeah, that was
what a surprise.
That was tough, but it's good to be forced to think about it that quickly as well. Actually, I think the DE&I thing. I have a real interest in a bit of a narrative, I think, that exists around, in particular, neurodivergent employees. And there's a lot of data around the levels of productivity, of innovation, of creativity that employers can gain by employing neurodiverse employees. And the workforce model doesn't always work. So yeah, when I'm thinking about the analytics side of things and even the tech side of things, the systems, that is a talent pool who I think actually would solve a lot of those other areas that we have to spend a lot of our time in or contribute really well to them. So that was sort of pulling me the DE&I side.
Okay, thanks for explaining. What is a neurodiverse person, just for the ones that are not aware?
Yeah, so somebody who's neurodivergent might have ADHD or autism, dyslexia. There's a lot of different ways that can show up. But there's been a lot of studies done recently that Deloitte did actually on the Big Four in the US. And they have a lot of programs for neurodivergent employees. And what they found was one piece of data that I thought was really interesting. Neurodivergent employees can be up to 90% more productive than a neurotypical employee. And when they have an interest, because it can be very interest based, they can hyper focus is one of the traits that can come with some of those neurodivergencies. That can go up to 140%.
Wow.
So the data is incredible. And yet the workforce model hasn't changed. So you've got really high unemployment rates in some of those groups. I think talent acquisition, the recruitment process is doing a lot now to create opportunity to engage and to be hired, but actually being able to sustain a career and the world of work can be a real challenge because of how their traits come up. So yeah, I'm hoping to really flip that narrative, how, employers actually have a lot to gain. And if they're willing to change their systems, their models, to be really inclusive, they will get a lot from that as well. So it's a really interesting topic.
Thanks for raising the awareness for the topic.
Yeah, always good.
We are close to the end, Lou. I always ask everyone that comes to the show if they could recommend someone that could be a good guest for the show, someone that has an interesting profile, project, life story. Who would you recommend for me to engage with?
I think one person who I've worked with from my early career, a woman called Ep10. She's a lot of things. She's incredible. She's an executive coach, works with a lot of leadership teams around emotional intelligence and building that to enable success.
Challenge accepted. It was nice to meet you, Lou.
Yes, and you. Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be able to just to air your thoughts and your views. We don't always take time to reflect, do we? So I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for that. And I hope one day we can meet somewhere remotely or in person to address the topic that we shared today. Goodbye.